Greetings and welcome to yet another episode of Into Zimbabwe, a weekly production brought to you by Protect Defender Zimbabwe and the National Association of Youth Organizations. And today we'll be discussing the operationalization of the Code of Ethics and Standards for Civil Society Organizations, especially in following the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. And to discuss this topic today, I am joined by Mr. Ernest Nyimai, the Executive Director of the National Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, NAYO. Ngoma Ernest,
yes.
How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm fine.
I'm glad to have you. So,
Yes.
without wasting much of your time, I think we can delve straight into the question.
Sure.
Can you shed more light to us on what is the CSO Code of Ethics and Standards?
Okay, so the NGO Code of Ethics and Standards, it's a mechanism that is internationally based practice in terms of ensuring that NGOs are self-regulating, which means coming up with our own benchmarks in terms of how our work should be done, in terms of the governance mechanisms and platform that is expected for an NGO, and more importantly, how NGOs can demonstrate legitimacy and accountability. So we are at a time where there is a shrinking civic space, and this is quite motivated by quite a number of factors, chief amongst it being repressive legislations that are introduced by governments seeking more control and regulation of the sector. So you'd find that NGOs are subjected to over-regulation and very administratively expensive requirements and operational modalities for them to do their work and service the constituencies and the communities that they work with. So the idea of a code of ethics is then to try and take that role of regulation and compliance from the regulators, which in most instances is the government. In Zimbabwe, in our case, especially for organizations that are registered in terms of the private voluntary organization, it's through the Ministry of Public Service, Labor and Social Welfare. So having that kind of a mechanism or a code of ethics, it then defines how we do our things, and it also comes with what we call sanctions in terms of making sure that there is peer accountability between organizations, because there are key characteristics such as we are supposed to be non-profit making. There are also issues around non-partisanship. So through the code of ethics and the code of conduct, you can actually be able to make sure that at least we peer review and make sure that there is peer accountability.
Okay, thank you for that. Then also we want to know then how important is the work of local CSOs to Zimbabwe's development trajectory?
Yes, civil society play a very pivotal role as partners to the government in terms of complementing government where it lacks comparative advantage or where we feel they are underserved communities. We understand that resources are scarce, not only to individuals or to institutions, even at economy level or as the government. We also lack resources, technical and human, to make sure that we advance the development trajectory. So as NGOs, we come in to complement those efforts through direct provision of services, especially to those communities and population groups that are often left behind. We talk about the youth, we talk about the children, we talk about the marginalized women, we talk about the persons with disabilities. But over and above that, government made quite a number of commitments through various international conventions. Even at national level, they come up with national development blueprints, like in our case, at the moment, in Zimbabwe, of the National Development Strategy 1. So it is also the role of NGOs or CSOs to then demand accountability over the implementation of various commitments. And I think this role has been quite instrumental in Zimbabwe, where historically Zimbabwe is known for coming up with very lucrative blueprints or development plans. But when it comes to implementation, there are a lot of gaps and challenges. So through a work of NGOs, we also then demand accountability, not only to development plans, but also more importantly to other key instruments like the Constitution. We push for rule of law, we push for constitutionalism, we also push for protection of human rights defenders, and also making sure that people are able to realize their rights. And we use quite a number of mechanisms like your universal periodic reviews. We also look at other issues to do with even alignment of various pieces of legislation that we have to the Constitution. We provide expert advice and input to those processes to really make sure that citizens are able to realize and enjoy their human rights as provided for in the Constitution.
Okay, yeah. While in line with that also, so what then do the Financial Action Task Force recommendations mean to the work of local civil society organizations, and is enough being done to implement them?
Yeah, the Financial Action Task Force, they are coming as recommendations around making sure that countries are able to deal with issues of money laundering and terrorism financing. Of course, they are voluntary. No country is forced to really implement the 40 recommendations that are there. But there are a lot of implications for not complying or implementing the recommendations. For instance, your country can be put under grey list, and also there are also sanctions with other key bodies like the EU. So these recommendations are quite important, and also it's a growing concern of increased terrorist activities globally. So these recommendations are coming to try and ensure that it assists governments or countries to really make sure that they put in place measures towards anti-money laundering and countering of terrorism financing. These recommendations, yes, they are important in that aspect of making sure that there is protection of people from terrorist activities, but the challenge that we have been observing, and we are actually noting with concern, is the increased securitization and weaponization of these recommendations, especially Recommendation 8, which speaks to the non-profit organizations, where as countries are trying to comply with the provisions, it comes with quite a lot of regulatory mechanisms and instruments that are being introduced. Here in Zimbabwe, we have witnessed instruments like the Private Voluntary Organization Amendment Bill coming at a time when the country is trying to comply, or the primary objective really is to make sure that as a country we comply with the recommendation. But there is a lot of misinterpretation of the recommendation itself procedurally. From the FATF standards and procedures, you are supposed to carry out what we call a non-profit organization risk assessment, which then gives us an indication in terms of the vulnerabilities that are there, and come up with a typology as to is the NGO sector in Zimbabwe really at risk? So we look at quite a number of things. Who is funding NGOs? How many? Who is the main actors? Whether the Financial Intelligence Unit and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe is able to monitor different transactions, and whether they are reporting mechanisms. But in Zimbabwe, we have seen the government proceeding to amend the law without necessarily carrying out the NPO risk assessment, and then apply what they call a risk-based approach, where according to the level of risk, you then come up with proportionate measures to deal with those risks. So right now in Zimbabwe, it seems like the government or the regulators are taking a blanket approach of assuming that NGOs are at risk, and they are now coming up with these laws, to try and regulate. And for us, it's actually contributing to the shrinking civil space, because we want a CSO enabling environment. And by CSO enabling environment, you are looking at a set of conditions which allow or prohibits NGOs to do their work. So as long as whatever instrument being introduced is actually acting as a barrier for us to be able to continue the work, then there is a problem. It's actually contributing to shrinking civic space.
Okay, so the idea of risk assessment is being over-politicized. In
Yes.
fact, risk description.
Yes. Nothing has been done.
Exactly.
So we are wondering, where is it coming from? Because procedurally, that was supposed to be the first step, so that we identify to say, okay, the NGO sector in Zimbabwe has these kind of risks. But you don't necessarily dwell much on risks as well. Risks might be there, but as long as there are adequate mitigation measures to deal with them, it's not a problem. Because from the different tools that are used to calculate what they call the risk typology for the NPO sector, it actually looks at both the vulnerabilities and the mitigation measures in place, and then they come up with what they call inherent risk, especially if the risks outweighs the mitigation measures in place, or the vulnerabilities rather outweighs the mitigation measures in place.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the main problem that we are facing, especially in the context of Zimbabwe.